I knew things were about to go sideways the moment Bryce dropped the word synergy unironically during his first all-hands meeting. That smug little trust fund baby came strutting in wearing his designer sneakers and quarter zip like he'd just invented the concept of running a business. Not inherited a corner office from the man who built this place from nothing. Name's Jim Cooper, and I'm 52 years old. Spent 10 years in the Navy before trading my uniform for a corporate badge 27 years ago. Thought I'd seen every kind of storm there was. Turned out I was wrong. I've been with High-On Systems since back when our servers were held together with duct tape and prayers, and our marketing team was whoever could throw together a halfway decent PowerPoint. I was there before the funding rounds, before we outgrew 2 office buildings, and long before anyone had heard of Bryce Kellerman with his MBA and his daddy issues. High-End Systems specializes in enterprise cybersecurity infrastructure, the kind of behind-the-scenes work that keeps Fortune 500 companies from getting their data stolen by kids in hoodies. We're not flashy, but we're essential. Defense contractors, financial institutions, healthcare networks, they all depend on our security protocols to keep their systems locked down tight. The founder, Arthur Hyan, built this company from a folding table in a rented storage unit. Good man, solid. He used to say, "Jim, processes make permanence," and I made sure every process had a paper trail, a timestamp, and a backup. When you've been somewhere long enough, you don't need a fancy title to know your worth. Technically, I was Chief Operations Officer. Internally, I was the guy you called when procurement stalled, compliance panicked, or legal forgot which version of the charter we were using. I kept the whole machine running without needing to raise my voice or send passive-aggressive emails with 17 people copied. Just got things done. That's how you do it. 27 years of vendor relationships don't build themselves. Neither do the compliance protocols that kept us audit-ready for government contracts, or the operational procedures that let us scale from 12 employees to over 200 without losing a single client to data breach. Then Arthur got sick, started fading about a year ago. Quietly at first, missed meetings, forgotten names, long pauses in conversations where he used to be sharp as a tack. He still had his moments, but the board got nervous. Nervous boards do stupid things, like handing control over to Bryce, Arthur's nephew, who once asked if we could just use AI to write our compliance reports. I wish I was making that up. From the second Bryce set foot in the office with his Tesla and his fake humility speech about honoring legacy while embracing innovation, I knew there was a countdown timer over my head. He made this big presentation about modernizing legacy systems while never once looking me in the eye. His eyes were usually glued to his phone anyway, scrolling through whatever crypto guru was promising to multiply his trust fund. I started noticing things. Small things first. My calendar permissions got restricted for no reason anyone could explain. People I'd trained were suddenly copying me on emails instead of just talking to me directly. Then I overheard him in the hallway telling HR I had museum energy. Museum energy. Like I was some dusty artifact taking up space. Here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you time. Quiet time. The kind where you go back through old files, pull up those PDFs nobody's opened since 2008, and remember every handshake deal that ever mattered. Arthur and I had an understanding built over 17 years. He trusted me to safeguard the company's foundation. And buried in those foundations were some very old, very real clauses with very sharp teeth. I didn't fight the changes at first. Let him replace our vendor liaison with his frat brother Kyle from Sigma Chi. Watched him convert our internal knowledge base into a Slack channel called Bryce Notes. Even kept my mouth shut when he rolled out Innovation Fridays like he'd discovered fire. But what I also did was quietly renew my notary license and dust off a certain 19-page document Arthur signed back in 2009. Started logging every interaction with HR into a private email thread. Made sure every piece of paper Bryce had never bothered to read was in perfect order. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preserving structure. The structure he was too arrogant to understand. Because here's what they don't teach you in business school. At least not between the networking events and case studies. The person who understands the foundation holds the power to shake the entire house. And I was about to give it one hell of a shake. The new hires started showing up in waves. Kyle Brennan got the title Organizational Culture Lead, which apparently meant posting motivational quotes in Slack and organizing team-building exercises nobody wanted. Zach Phillips, another college buddy, became our strategy architect despite thinking a Gantt chart was some kind of European cheese. Meanwhile, people who had been with the company for years started disappearing. Our vice president of vendor relations gone. The woman who built our onboarding system from scratch while pregnant with twins, reassigned to some made-up role with no real responsibilities. Each departure felt like losing a piece of the company's memory. I kept my head down and did my job. Morning routine never changed. Black coffee, review overnight reports, check with the operations team, make sure everything was running smooth. Bryce would breeze in around 10 with his matcha latte and spend the day in strategic planning sessions that seemed to involve a lot of whiteboard markers and not much actual planning. Arthur still came in sometimes, on his good days. We'd sit in his office and he'd tell me stories about the early days, back when it was just him and a couple of engineers trying to build something that mattered. Those conversations reminded me why I'd stayed so long. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission. And missions don't end just because some kid decides he wants to play CEO. The purge kicked into high gear about 3 months after Bryce took over. It wasn't dramatic, no big announcements or company-wide emails. Just people quietly disappearing, their access cards deactivated, their desks cleaned out over the weekend. Patrice Williams, our payroll systems manager who'd been here 12 years, came in Monday morning to find her computer locked out. HR told her they were restructuring the department for efficiency. She'd brought me soup during flu season back in 17. Now she was escorted out without so much as a goodbye email. That one hit different. Started making my own preparations. See, when you spend 10 years in the Navy as an operations specialist, you learn a few things about contingency planning. Managing logistics for a destroyer teaches you that details matter. Miss one supply requisition, one maintenance schedule, one communication protocol, and people can die. In corporate world, the stakes are lower, but the principles are the same. You document everything. You keep backups of your backups. And you never assume the people in charge know what they're doing just because they're in charge. So while Bryce was busy posting LinkedIn articles about disrupting legacy thinking, I was doing what I do best, making sure the paperwork was in order. All of it, including the stuff buried so deep in our corporate charter that most people forgot it existed. That old 2009 operational reversion agreement, for instance. 20 pages of legal language that Arthur and I had drafted when we incorporated. He was paranoid back then, worried that someday the board might get swayed by family connections instead of competence. Smart man. We wrote in some safeguards, legal tripwires that would activate if certain conditions were met. I pulled out that document one evening in my den at home, spread it across my desk next to my old Navy commendation letters and challenge coins. Read through every clause twice. The language was crystal clear. If certain key personnel were terminated without proper board approval and severance compliance, operational control would revert to the founder's trust within 72 hours. I'd helped write those words 17 years ago. Now they might be my lifeline. The next morning, I renewed my notary license. Hadn't used it in years, but muscle memory kicked in. By afternoon, I had all the documentation I needed, properly witnessed and sealed, just in case. Meanwhile, Bryce was making his mark on the company culture. Innovation Fridays turned into mandatory fun, where everyone had to share their disruptive ideas in the break room. Kyle Brennan started hosting synergy sessions that were basically group therapy for people who thought Slack was a personality trait. The worst part was watching good people try to adapt. Engineers who'd been cranking out solid code for years suddenly had to explain their work in terms of agile methodology and user journey optimization. Marketing folks who knew our customer base inside and out got lectured about growth hacking by kids who'd never closed a deal in their lives. I kept my mouth shut and my head down, but I also kept my eyes open. Bryce's morning routine was predictable. Roll in around 10 with his matcha latte and Tesla earbuds, check his crypto portfolio, then spend an hour scrolling through startup podcasts while pretending to review reports. The man couldn't focus on one thing for more than 5 minutes unless it involved his phone. His afternoon strategic planning sessions usually meant Kyle and Zach hanging out in the conference room, throwing around buzzwords and drawing circles on the whiteboard. I walked past one day and heard them debating whether our customer service approach was disruptive enough. These guys were talking about disrupting customer service, like helping people who paid us money was some kind of outdated concept. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't going to end well for any of us. The writing was on the wall by the time they started messing with my access permissions. Nothing dramatic. Just little restrictions here and there. Couldn't view certain budget reports anymore. Got locked out of the vendor management system I'd been using for 15 years. When I asked IT about it, they said it was part of a security audit. Security audit. Right. Then came the calendar restrictions. Meetings I'd been part of for years suddenly had new attendee lists that didn't include me. strategy sessions where they discussed operations decisions without the actual operations officer. I'd get forwarded the notes later, usually with some comment about keeping legacy stakeholders informed. Legacy stakeholders. That's what I'd become. The final straw was overhearing Bryce in the hallway talking to someone from HR. Museum energy, he said, like he was describing a particularly stubborn stain. We need to modernize the whole operational mindset. Some people are just too comfortable with the old ways. I didn't react, didn't say anything, just filed it away with all the other documentation I'd been collecting. But that night, sitting in my den with a beer and looking at the photos from my Navy days, I made a decision. If Bryce wanted to play hardball, I'd show him what 27 years of institutional knowledge could do when properly motivated. The next morning, I started making calls, not to lawyers or headhunters, to people who mattered. Old contacts at vendor companies who'd been doing business with us since the early days. Regulatory folks who knew our compliance history. Board members I'd worked with during the transition periods when Arthur was setting up the corporate structure. Quiet conversations, professional check-ins, just making sure everyone had my direct contact information in case anything unusual happened with the company's operational continuity. Because in my experience, when someone starts talking about removing legacy stakeholders, they usually don't stop to think about what happens when all that legacy knowledge walks out the door. Arthur came in that Tuesday, one of his better days. We sat in his office and he asked me how things were going with the transition. I could have told him about the access restrictions, the calendar games, the museum energy comment. Instead, I just said things were moving along and asked him about his health. "Jim," he said, looking out the window at the parking lot where his nephew's Tesla was taking up 2 spaces, "I want you to know I've always trusted your judgment. Whatever happens, I know you'll do the right thing." He didn't know about Bryce's plans. Didn't know his nephew was systematically dismantling everything he'd built. But somehow he knew I'd handle it. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my job anymore. It was about preserving what Arthur had created, protecting the people who'd helped build it, and making sure 27 years of hard work didn't get flushed down the drain by someone who thought disruption was a business strategy. The mission parameters were clear. Time to execute. It happened at 7:59 a.m. on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Only a coward schedules a termination meeting before most people have poured their first cup of coffee. I was still locking my car in the garage when the meeting invite popped up on my phone. Subject line, quick sync. Location, HR conference room B. Sent at 7:56 a.m. No context, no agenda, just corporate speak for you're done. Bryce was already there when I walked in, legs crossed, sipping some green sludge from a mason jar like he'd just rolled out of a yoga retreat. Melissa Torres, our HR director, sat beside him looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. I gave her a nod. She didn't return it. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Jim," he said, like my name left a bad taste in his mouth. "We've been evaluating our organizational strategy, and after a lot of difficult discussions," he actually smiled here, the little weasel, "we've decided to sunset your role as part of our modernization initiative." Sunset, like I was a failed email campaign. I didn't react. Just tilted my head the way you do when someone tries to explain why the sky is green. Let him keep talking. "We really appreciate your historical contributions," he continued, dragging out the word historical like I was something they'd dug up in an archaeological dig. "But it's important to stay relevant in today's landscape." That was the gift right there. The phrase that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just cutting dead weight. He thought this was a teaching moment. "Consider this your final lesson," he said, like he was some kind of startup sensei. I smiled, tight-lipped, no teeth, just a professional acknowledgement. Stood up, picked up my coffee mug, then set it back down. Wasn't gonna need it where I was going. The walk to the elevator felt like the longest parade I'd ever been in, except nobody was clapping. People just looked away like termination was contagious. The elevator ride down was empty, which was fine by me. Got in my car, shut the door, and let myself have exactly 1 moment. Slammed my fist on the steering wheel once, hard enough to make the horn chirp. Then I composed myself, opened my banking app, and deposited my final paycheck. Bryce had it ready to go. Efficient little overachiever. That timestamp mattered. Everything from here on out was about timing and precision. The reversion clause was specific. 72 business hours from the moment of improper termination. Arthur had insisted on that time frame back in 2009, long enough for cooler heads to prevail, short enough to prevent prolonged chaos. We'd written it assuming any future board would want to correct a mistake quickly rather than let the company drift without operational leadership. Next stop, Notary Public. I had the letter already printed, sealed, and labeled for the board's general counsel. All it needed was the official stamp. The notary raised an eyebrow when she read the first line, but didn't ask questions. Just signed, stamped, and slid it back across the counter. Then came the courier service. I'd set up same-day delivery 2 weeks ago, just in case. The driver asked if it needed a signature confirmation. Told him yes, but only from the company's general counsel, Lisa Hartwell. No substitutes, no exceptions. He left, and I sat in my car outside the coffee shop across from our building. Didn't go home. Just watched through the tinted windows and waited. Saw Bryce leave the building an hour later, laughing with Kyle about something, probably celebrating how easy it had been to get rid of the old guy. What he didn't know was that the envelope now making its way through downtown traffic contained more than just a resignation acknowledgement. It was a formal notice of termination executed under Section 4.8 of the 2009 Operational Reversion Agreement, a clause so buried in our corporate charter that most of the current legal team had forgotten it existed. But I hadn't. I'd helped Arthur draft that agreement when we incorporated, and I'd made sure it stayed active through every compliance audit since. The language was ironclad. If certain key personnel were terminated without full board approval and proper severance compliance, operational control of high-end systems would revert within 72 business hours to the founder's trust. The appointee listed in that trust wasn't some random board member or legal advisor. It was me. Bryce had just pulled the pin on his own grenade and he didn't even know it yet. The best part was watching him through the coffee shop window, strutting around the parking lot like he'd just conquered Rome. Posted something on his social media about making room for innovation with a bunch of fire emojis. Someone forwarded me the screenshot later. From his corner office, which used to be a supply closet until he had it remodeled with mid-century modern vibes. He was probably already planning his next round of terminations, ordering catered lunch for the team, celebrating what he thought was his graceful removal of legacy friction. I wasn't surprised. Bryce had all the emotional depth of a puddle. What I was counting on was his arrogance. The same arrogance that made him wave off the legal memo his assistant probably slid under his smoothie that afternoon. Hey, legal flagged something in the old governance files about Jim's termination. They said it might warrant review. I could picture him shrugging it off between sips of his ridiculous green drink. Whatever, we handled that years ago. Let compliance run in circles if they want, except we hadn't handled it. Every 3 years, like clockwork during our compliance audits, I'd made sure that reversion clause stayed active, recertified, and notarized. I had the documentation to prove it. Most of the current team wasn't around in 2009. They didn't know about Arthur's paranoia, didn't understand the safeguards we'd built into the foundation of the company. They thought corporate governance was just a bunch of paperwork that lawyers handled. Meanwhile, the courier was threading through downtown traffic, GPS tracking showing steady progress toward our building. The envelope contained my notarized execution notice, cross-referenced with board charter documents and a copy of Arthur's trust appointment directive. All dated, signed, filed with the state exactly as required. Bryce didn't know the clock had started ticking at 7:59 a.m. Didn't know he had exactly 71 hours and 4 minutes left before losing operational authority. Didn't know that legal was already pulling interns to dig through the archived governance binders. The physical ones nobody looked at unless I asked them to. By 12:03 p.m., my phone showed the delivery confirmation. Signed for by Lisa Hartwell, General Counsel, High-End Systems. I had my paper trail, timestamps, emails, tracking confirmations, even a recorded voicemail to my personal attorney noting the event. All within the 72-hour window. That evening, I got a single-line email from Lisa. Please confirm whether you've executed the reversion clause as outlined in Article 4.8. I replied, executed, time-stamped, and delivered as required. Effective immediately. Best regards, Jim Cooper. Then I sat back, opened a beer, and watched the Slack notifications pile up on my old phone. The whispers had begun. They just didn't know it was already too late. By Thursday morning, the walls were sweating. Bryce hadn't shaved in 2 days. His once perfect hair was sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it all night, which he probably had. The startup swagger he wore like cologne had curdled into something desperate. The board had been in emergency session since Wednesday afternoon. Phones off, no assistants, just 12 people in a room trying to figure out whether their company was about to face a legal crisis that could affect every government contract we held. When cybersecurity firms lose operational continuity, federal clients don't wait around to see how it plays out. Lisa Hartwell had spent the night reviewing every page of our corporate charter, and what she'd found wasn't making anyone happy, especially not Bryce. I got 6 voicemails from him that morning. The first one was still cocky. Hey Jim, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Let's talk this through like professionals. The second had some wobble in it. I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding. Legal's kind of freaking out, and I'd love to clarify a few things. By the sixth message, he wasn't even trying to hide the panic. Jim, please, just call me back. We can work something out. I didn't call back. Sometimes silence says more than words. Meanwhile, inside High-On headquarters, the executive Slack channels had turned into a digital riot. Someone, probably from the board, had leaked that there was a legacy clause situation under legal review. By noon, our PR team had fielded a dozen calls from tech journalists who'd caught wind of executive instability at a mid-sized systems company. One local news station sent a camera crew to the front steps. They got footage of Kyle Brennan having what looked like a panic attack in the parking lot when a reporter asked him about operational continuity concerns. Bryce tried damage control with a company-wide email about collaborative leadership transitions and elevating institutional knowledge to advisory roles. Legal wouldn't approve it. Said it could be interpreted as confirmation that he'd lost operational authority, so he sent it anyway. The reply all responses started immediately. Someone from accounting wrote back with 3 words, "Is Jim returning?" That email got forwarded to me by 5 different people. By Thursday afternoon, they'd made the decision to bring Arthur into it. His health had been declining, but he was still legally competent during his good stretches. The trust's executor flew out that morning to brief him on the situation. Bryce wasn't allowed in the room. Instead, Lisa Hartwell went, along with 2 board members and a court reporter. They returned 3 hours later looking like they'd just witnessed something they couldn't quite process. Lisa placed her notes on the conference table and said quietly, "The founder has been informed of the clause activation and the pending reversion." He was shown the notarized documents, the timestamps, and the trust directive. Meredith Walsh, the board chair, asked, "Did he understand the implications?" Lisa nodded, completely. When we showed him the name of the designated appointee, he smiled and said, "Jim always was the most thorough person I ever met." That word, smiled, hit Bryce like a physical blow. He dropped into his chair like someone had cut his strings. "This is insane," he said to the room. "You're letting some old document override a 9-figure company because of what? Nostalgia?" Lisa turned slowly. "No, Bryce. We're honoring a legal contract that you triggered when you terminated the one person who knew it existed." The room went quiet. There were 18 hours left on the 72-hour clock. I spent that night at home, sitting in my den with a beer and my old Navy photos. Wasn't celebrating, just reviewing the mission parameters one more time. Everything had gone according to plan, but you don't count victory until the objective is secured. At exactly 8 a.m. on Friday morning, the courier arrived at the boardroom with my final documentation package. Same guy who delivered the termination notice 3 days earlier. This time, he was carrying the operational transfer paperwork, properly notarized and sealed. The board was already assembled when I walked in. Same conference room where Bryce had given his synergy presentation 6 months ago. But this time, every person seated had the look of someone who'd learned not to underestimate the fine print. I didn't make a speech, didn't gloat or grandstand, just walked to the head of the table, connected my flash drive to the presentation system, and pulled up a simple company-wide message: "Steady hand, steady course. Back to work." Meredith Walsh looked around the table. "All in favor of acknowledging the operational transfer under Section 4. 8 of the reversion agreement?" Hands went up one by one. "All of them. All opposed?" Nobody moved. Bryce cleared his throat from his seat by the window. "You can't be serious. You're just gonna hand him the keys like this is some kind of corporate fairy tale?" I finally looked at him directly. Kid looked like he'd aged 5 years and 3 days. "Bryce," I said, keeping my voice level. "Nepotism's cute until it hits the charter." Security entered the room without being called. Professional courtesy. I'd asked them to be discreet about it. Bryce stood up, adjusting his wrinkled quarter zip. "Don't bother," he said, trying to salvage some dignity. "I can find my own way out." As he reached the door, I handed him an envelope. His separation agreement, already approved by the board. Fair terms. More than fair, actually. Arthur had taught me to be gracious in victory. He took the envelope, looked at it for a long moment, then back at me. "You really think you've won something here?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. Thought about Arthur in his hospital bed, trusting me to preserve what he'd built. About Patrice Williams and all the other good people who'd been shown the door for no reason except somebody's ego. About 17 years of getting up every morning and doing the work that mattered. "Bryce," I said, "this was never about winning. It was about finishing the mission." He left without another word. I heard his Tesla start up in the parking lot a few minutes later. The room was quiet after he was gone. Lisa Hartwell was packing up her files. Meredith Walsh was already checking her phone for the next crisis. Just another day in corporate America. Except this time, institutional knowledge had won over nepotism. I pulled out my old coffee mug, the one I'd left behind Tuesday morning. Someone had washed it and put it back in my office. Probably someone from the operations team who understood what it meant to have me back. Made a fresh pot of coffee, black, the way I'd been drinking it for 27 years. Sat down at my desk and opened the operations reports I'd missed while all this was going on. 3 days without proper oversight, and already I could see where things were starting to slip. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the early warning signs were there. Delayed vendor payments, missed compliance check-ins, security protocol updates sitting in someone's inbox unread. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my old Navy buddies. Heard through the grapevine you had some excitement at work. Everything squared away? I typed back, mission accomplished. Because that's what this was, really. Not revenge, not some dramatic corporate coup. Just a professional completing his assigned duties under changing conditions. The way we'd been trained to do. Arthur came by the office that afternoon, one of his better days. We sat in his old chair by the window, looking out at the parking lot where Bryce's Tesla used to take up 2 spaces. "You did good, Jim," he said. "Company's in steady hands now." I nodded. "That was always the plan, sir." "I know," he said. "That's why I put your name in that envelope 17 years ago." Outside, the afternoon shift was changing over. Engineers heading home to their families, night security coming on duty, cleaning crew getting ready for their rounds. The same rhythm that had been running this place since before Bryce was old enough to spell disruption. Some things are worth preserving. Some missions are worth finishing. And sometimes the best revenge is just doing your job right. I finished my coffee, locked up my office, and headed home. Tomorrow was Monday. There'd be operations reports to review, vendor calls to make, compliance audits to schedule. The real work of running a company, just the way it should be.